Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This one's going to be for book 4, which is called Vampire Mountain. So we finished the first, trilogy, the first quarter of the series, and then we move into the second quarter. The second trilogy is sort of called together the Vampire Rights trilogy. So it's book 4, Vampire Mountain, book 5, Trials of Death, and book 6, The Vampire Prince. And so yeah, obviously together these make up a very vampire focused trilogy, which will more heavily explore, of course, the sort of culture of the vampires, the inner workings of it, because we're in sort of their kind of main base of operations here in Vampire Mountain at the council, of course. So most of the vampires are sort of gathered up here, but we also get a deeper insight into sort of more of the details on the issue with the Vampanese and so on, and that will play a role going into the next two books, as was sort of touched on here with Kurda Schmalt, a vampire prince-to-be who basically wants at some point to have peace with the Vampanese. That's one of the things he wants to accomplish when he becomes a prince, and he's an important character coming into play here. But reading this one again, I was surprised at sort of how much I remembered. Like, I remembered that there were some incidents on the way up. I remembered the bear attack. I didn't quite remember the stuff with the wolves, but then once I got into it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, this makes complete sense. Darren already has sort of a connection with animals, as we saw with Madame Octa, so of course it would make sense that wolves, which are friendly with vampires, would also get on well with him. But yeah, I remembered the bear that drank Vampanese blood, who's gone mad, that being the kind of main threat there. But I had also forgotten, like, directly a part of that oh yeah, Mr. Tiny sends two little people with them as well. One of them gets killed, and then Lefty is revealed to actually be able to speak, and his name is Harkat Molds, which is a reveal I thought that didn't happen until later on, but then I realized, oh yeah, it kind of has to take place this early on, so Darren and Harkat can actually become friends and so on. It's in that sense, like, I was kind of, my thoughts going into this one were that, like, is this one pretty much just, traveling, and then the more relaxed early section of this arc where it is just Darren getting used to being in Vampire Mountain, meeting all the other vampires. But I think there's enough, like, action and kind of world building reveals here that it makes the book still feel pretty exciting, which is where, like, I suppose the little action sequences with the bear attack, the fight on the bars with Ara and stuff like that is really interesting. But yeah, Mr. Tiny appearing quite early on in the book after you've just found out that, oh yeah, by the way, 6-year time skip between the last book and this one. It's kind of like, whoa, Darren's like 20 in this book. I don't think they say it directly, like what exact age he is, but we know he was 12 in like the first book, so if like basically 2 years have passed over the course of the first 3, and now another 6, he's 20 now. And this becomes sort of a plot point as, of course, they're going to Vampire Mountain because Mr. Crepsley has to present Darren to the vampire princes and finally address what's been set up since the second book, that Gavner, I believe it was, said, like, wait, you blooded him despite him being so young? And him asking a few questions about, like, did you know all of this? And it being like, oh, so it's a problem that Darren has been blooded at such a young age. And the fact that we directly see that. He is 20 now, but he only looks like 13 or 14. There's your problem, as the princes directly talk about in the meeting right at the end of this book. But yeah, Mr. Tiny comes in again. And again, like, we haven't seen him much in the series, but he is such a important player in things. And this book especially really gets across, I suppose, that, oh yeah, like, he was threatening when you first saw him, but now you have a much better sense about who this guy is, of just, like, he is basically this godlike being who, like, creates the little people. Like, what we find out about the little people when Harkat Molds finally, speaks, that there are people who have died who have been offered like a second chance at life by Mr. Tiny, and he kind of creates them basically in this new form to sort of serve him for a set amount of time, which is very interesting that just he's capable of doing that, but then also that he is so heavily involved in like the history of vampires and so on, because the the prince's main what was the specific wording on it again? Um, Anyway, the prince's chambers, basically, they established that Mr. Tiny, as a gift to the vampires, built the dome area where all the princes, basically have their kind of thrones, basically, and it's this borderline like invulnerable material that none of the vampires know what it is. The best architects they've got in have no idea what this material is. And it basically functions like sort of almost electric doors, but they established that it was made so many years ago that electricity can't possibly be involved, highlighting that it runs basically on magic effectively, but obviously it's linked into like the blood of the princes and so on. Um, and then yeah, we get stuff like the Stone of Blood. Is that actually what it's called? I literally just finished reading the book, so yeah, the Stone of Blood here, which we find out its main function is that you can track basically any blooded and bonded vampire through it. Primarily, the princes use it, but it seems like anyone who is a vampire or vampanese can use it. So the vampires holding onto it is kind of important. But if the vampanese ever got a hold of it, it would be the death of everyone. But then you also have to get into the whole idea that part of the reason he sent the little people with them to Vampire Mountain is that he wants to present this message to the princes, which is basically that the destined Lord of the Vampanese is going to sort of reappear at some point. And it links into sort of what Mr. Tiny has said to, I suppose, the vampires and the Vampanese in the past. He's sort of given them almost a destiny that there is a Lord of the Vampanese and he'll rise up at some point, but now it's happening sooner than you think. But then the vampires also believe that even if they do fall, that the Stone of Blood will be the key to sort of returning them back to kind of glory, basically. So very, very interesting and intriguing stuff with Mr. Tiny. I kind of almost didn't realize until going back through it here just how kind of clear cut they are, just about like, yeah, Mr. Tiny is like basically a godlike being. The way he's presented in scenes where he actually talks to characters, he doesn't particularly come across that way, but then everything they say about what he does and is capable of makes it clear that he is controlling a lot of stuff that's going on here. But yeah, the reveal of Harkat being able to talk is interesting because, of course, it shocks both Mr. Crepsley and Gavner. Like, they're just like what? Like, we've been alive so long, we've never heard a little person speak, yet here's one who by the end of this book is able to speak like relatively well. So that's just quite interesting by itself. But yeah, along the way, Darren, with the wolves is quite an interesting connection, and it links into the whole idea that, oh yeah, like he had a really good relationship with Madame Octa, so he has a connection with spiders. But now we find out that wolves are also sort of linked in with vampires also, because Mr. Crepsey calls them their cousins. Going into the myths around the origin of vampires, of that there's sort of almost a familial connection there, which I believe they do reveal more about later on. I can't remember the exact details of it now, but I definitely remember there's some sort of deeper origin stuff that relates to wolves. I just don't remember it off the top of my head right now. But still, it's a nice connection here, and just, you get to see that this is a really important talent that Darren has, of just his connection with animals. And obviously it's something that Mr. Crepsley has as well, and also something that Sebanile, when we meet him, also has. So it's just that nice connection of the different generations of vampires here all having a similar talent. But yeah, along the way they find out about there's sort of vampanese in the area. Of one was attacked by a bear, but because it fed on the blood, it's gone mad, and that's the one that Darren has to face. And with the help of the little people, kill. Also, the wolves are involved as well. But yeah, it's a pretty brutal scene. Like Darren is forced to use the one of the jagged bones of the dead little person to take out the bear. But still, it's an important scene to see that, like, after all these years of training with Mr. Krebs, that he is capable of, winning a fight like this, even against the odds, which will link, I suppose, into what's going to happen in the next book, and that, like, oh yeah, he's going to be against the odds during the trials, but we've seen him overcome stuff before. Um, but I suppose that pretty much gets us to Vampire Mountain. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here of just as we find out about all the different halls are named after famous vampires. We find out a lot more about the traditions of the vampires here as well, and how they are almost like a culture that is so lost in their traditions that they're holding themselves back. Just the little ones we find out about like the journey to Vampire Mountain, that, like, the council is held only every 12 years, but that you're not allowed to flit on the final stage of the journey to Vampire Mountain. You have to do it barefoot. They basically had to almost break the rules to allow rest stops along the way, and it just is such this sense of, like, they always have to, like, test themselves, even just to get back to their sort of spiritual home of Vampire Mountain. It's almost like it's too much, and so it sort of sets the stage for, like, oh, you can almost understand now why the Vampanese would break away, not happy with how many rules and traditions the vampires have, and wanting to do things their own way. Now, of course, you do get that sense from what we've been told about the Vampanese origin, is that part of it comes just from the perspective of, like, they value killing humans, and they feel it's, like, disrespectful to not kill a human that you drink from. But that gets very interesting when we're introduced to Curtis Smalt, a vampire prince to be, and we find out that what he wants to do when he becomes a prince is to try and actually establish peace with the Vampanese. And, like, he gets it that, like, there's obviously issues with their approach, but that the Vampanese have issues with the vampire approach. They're going to have to make sort of concessions on both sides. And this, of course, is all set up for, of course, as I've said already, the general plot across the whole series eventually sort of being vampires versus Vampanese, and this is sort of setting the stage for, they've sort of kept out of each other's way for quite a while, but now, in part because, of course, Mr. Krabs has just had a showdown with the Vampanese, Mr. Tiny is basically telling the vampires the Lord of the Vampanese is coming back. It's, like, destined basically to happen that they come to blows again. But how does this sort of peace process link into everything? So there's a lot of interesting dynamics at play here. But yeah, arriving actually at Vampire Mountain is quite interesting because we obviously get to meet, like, a ton of new characters, and I think it's the Darren Shan, the writer, does a really good job at making them all feel sort of unique, while also, he's introduced, like, at least 5, 6, 7 notable vampire characters here at once, and they do all feel relatively unique. So obviously Mr. Crepsley's his the person, I suppose, Mr. Crepsley was the assistant to Seba Nile, one of the older vampires, and just how kind of similar they are, that Mr. Crepsley has taken a lot of his own traits from Seba, like wearing all one color, the red, the animal kind of connection as well. We find out that Seba's the quartermaster in Vampire Mountain, which is part of why he's been able to live so long. They really bring up the idea that the life of a vampire is a very harsh one, because you're always sort of challenged to test yourself constantly in fighting and combat, which is why even though they can live for a very long time, not many vampires end up living for the max extent of their life. But it is interesting here to see what some of the upper limits kind of are. Like Seba's over 700 years old. Paris, as we meet later, one of the princes, the oldest vampire, is over 800 years old. Because as we find out, he was blooded at 2 years old. So that's why he's been able to live super, super long. But yeah, like as we go on, we get to meet like what Vanez is the kind of weapons kind of expert. He runs the games. We meet Ara, who's like the expert at the bars, as we see, and Darren kind of proves himself to everyone a little bit by being able to sort of challenge her. He doesn't win, of course, but I think it's an important scene to just show the traits that sort of drew Mr. Crepsley to Darren to a lot of the other vampires. That Darren having this like tour of the mountain before he meets the princes means that he ends up with kind of having a few people to argue his case in the prince's chambers later on, in the dome. So Gavner has met Darren and vouches for him. Ara now does, because she respects him sticking in that fight, the way it went, and the fact that he has potential. Mr. Crepsley, of course, vouches for him, and so on. And I think a lot of Kurda, of course, Kurda, as well. And I think that's really good. In addition to like just the princes themselves, while yes, they are the leaders of like vampire society, they're relatively reasonable. Yes, they obviously have to stick by the rules ultimately, and the decision they make is a relatively harsh one. But in the grand scheme of like how your borderline maybe expected things to go, it went about as well as you could expect, given how honor, nobility focused the vampires ultimately sort of turn out to be here. It was nice to see sort of like Paris as sort of like the head prince almost, kind of stopping Mika, I think was the one sort of beginning to sort of go off on Mr. Crepsley, that there was that sense constantly of like, we're not here to criticize Mr. Crepsley, who otherwise has a very good name within vampire culture. But it did prompt us the question of like, wait, we've been asking this for all of the first 4 books basically. Why did Mr. Crepsley blood Darren? Like, okay, we know the deal happened, Darren stole Madame Octa and stuff like that, but Mr. Crepsley set things up in a way where he really like forced the situation to sort of turn out this way. And his response here is quite interesting in that he very much just admits his full guilt in all of this, and that he doesn't really have a good explanation for why he did any of it. The most interesting part of it really is when he finally kind of gets to the root of it and like reveals that like, Darren's friend Steve approached me first. I don't know why I actually even considered blooding him or like starting the test, but I just did it. And I can't explain why that exactly happened. And again, it gets into this whole idea of that it feels like it was destiny that happened, that he almost went against character there to do something he usually wouldn't do, because we know it's sort of a trait of Mr. Crepsley, and a few of the other characters who meet him point that out. It's just like, I never thought you would ever take on an assistant, let alone such a young one. And a few characters say that to him, and it highlights just that, wow, that was a kind of really out of the blue, out of character moment for him. What went on here? And it's just so interesting to consider. But the result, obviously, by the end of the book is that they decide that, okay, they don't really want to sort of necessarily punish anyone, but that there needs to be some sense of proving themselves. So they can't just let this slide. So what they're going to do is they're going to have Darren actually prove himself. And this will sort of, if Darren can prove himself, obviously it proves he's worthy to be a vampire, but it also proves that Mr. Crepsley was correct in his decision of choosing to blood someone like him. So they basically are sort of almost like, it's almost like the prince is like being like, okay, you're vouching for Darren that you really feel like he has strong potential, so prove it. Do the trials now. And I think they all know it's somewhat unfair. They know that like it's going to be a very heavy test for a half vampire, a young half vampire, to do the test that usually a relatively experienced full vampire would do. So the odds are like completely stacked against Darren here. But a few of the characters standing up for him, like Ara and Gavner and so on, Kurda, if you feel like, okay, he should be able to get through it. These 5 random tests that he's going to have to do. But obviously the one thing Darren didn't properly account for was that, like, oh, wait, if I fail, I die. Like, he thought, like, if he failed, like, okay, it'd be like his honor would be gone, but he'd still be allowed to live, and it would just be like, it would reflect poorly on Mr. Crepsley. But no, he's going to be sentenced to go to the Hall of Death and be like dropped onto all those spikes that we encountered earlier. And that's the threat here of like sort of a typical Darren moment sort of in the series of like thinking things through to a certain point, but ultimately sort of getting himself into a situation where it's a little bit way beyond what he expected. But you know, we know the sort of character that he is now, and he is going to do everything that he can to pass these trials. And in that sense, like this book has been like mostly set up in that like we don't really get a sense for like just how skilled Darren is after these last 6 years. The fight against Ara on the bars, of course, gave us some sense of like, okay, good balance, was able to adapt to using the staff relatively quickly. He had a few nice enough moves, but he went into that fight with the clear expectation he was going to lose eventually, and it was just proving himself in that one. But in more clear-cut tests of strength and agility and so on, how is he actually going to perform? And that's the real challenge here. And I think it's a great way to end the book because it sets up suddenly book 5 to be Darren is going to be put through hell, basically. But we'll get there. Any other points I want to make here is just that Kurda, I thought like is going to be a super important character over the next few books. But I did like how different he immediately felt. That Mr. Crepsley is relatively like kind of on the same page for the most part as the princes with regards to, he is full on like, no, these are the rules of the vampires. We have to obey by them. Whereas Kurda is more like, I don't really agree with how locked into tradition that we are about all of this stuff. Him giving Darren the tour and just explaining like, yeah, this is the way it is. I don't really agree with it, but it's how it is. Him wanting and him, establishing that, his history is that he's went out to meet with the Vampanese to try and create some sort of a dynamic with them already, and there's some sense of trust there between certain members of the Vampanese and Kurda, so that if he's made a prince, he can make an official, attempt at a peace treaty, and it could actually work. So you see like a lot of potential in him, but it also highlights when they point out that, oh yeah, in terms of the voting for the next prince, he only just barely was like elected as like the next prince, highlighting that like just as many people disagree with him being the next prince as agree with him, and it just highlights the sort of split within vampire culture of those who are locked into the rules versus those who kind of want them to change a little bit. But overall, I think book 4 is really, really strong. I think it was such a good thing to do after 3 books of kind of introduction into like Darren becoming, and then seeing him adapt to being a half vampire, properly being the assistant, establishing the full trust between Darren and Larton. We finally delve more heavily into vampires and getting to go to basically the home area of the vampires where they're just out in the open comfortably. It's just vampires doing everything in the vampire way. That was really nice to see, and you just get a full book pretty much all about vampire culture, which is kind of what we needed at this point, to see kind of Darren reacting to just this is your world now. How do you feel about it? And obviously he asks like a lot of questions as we go through this, and there's like teases along the way about like the different aspects of kind of how things work. But you know, really good introduction. So that's basically my thoughts on the book. Next week, of course, we're going to go into book 5, Trials of Death, which is a pretty eventful book. I like that there's immediately the setup for what this book is going to be about. Is Darren going to be training and then doing the trials themselves? And so a lot of the characters we met in this book are obviously going to have to help to, train Darren. The allies that he has already are going to help him, and we'll see how the trials actually go, given that he's up against the odds. He's going into these trials as a half vampire that are pretty much meant for more experienced full vampires. Can he get through them? How many will he get through? What's going to happen? And I do really like that. So that's next week, but that's been my thoughts on book 4. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.